November 7th, 1849. Savannah, Georgia. The woman on the auction block was 22 years old, 5 months pregnant, and already rubbed raw at the wrist from the rope that bound her hands. She stood barefoot on the wooden platform in the center of the public market, the November sun already warm on her shoulders. Around her, the square buzzed with the usual sounds of commerce traders arguing over cotton prices, wagon wheels grinding over cobblestones, gulls shrieking above the masts in the harbor, but on the platform there was a strange, uneasy silence. The auctioneer broke it. Female. Name of Dinah, he called, his voice practiced and clear. Approximately 22 years of age, with 5 months by estimation. Trained in domestic service. Can cook, clean, and perform all household duties. His name was Cyrus Feldman, and he held the folded bill of sale between long, ink-stained fingers. He had sold furniture and horses that morning, an elderly cook and a strong young man, and each transaction had passed like clockwork. Bid, counterbid, the slap of his palm on the podium, the rustle of money changing hands. But now, as his eyes moved to the final line on the document, his brow creased. Minimum bid. He hesitated, and several men in the crowd leaned closer. 19 cents. The words seemed to hang in the air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the market erupted. 19 cents? Someone laughed, incredulous. What's wrong with her? Another demanded. She diseased? Mad, maybe. A third man muttered. Or carrying trouble. In the world of slavery, price meant everything. A healthy woman of childbearing age could fetch hundreds of dollars, more if she was skilled or pregnant. A price set lower than a pound of coffee was not just unusual. It was a message. She is worthless. She is damaged. She is meant for someone who understands what that price really means. On the platform, Dinah, who would later call herself Dinah, kept her eyes fixed on the far side of the square. She did not look at Feldman. She did not look at the men who studied her like livestock. She stared past them, past the market, past the tall brick buildings and the swaying ship masts, toward nothing at all if she let her mind drift far enough. She could almost pretend she was somewhere else. On the rice plantation outside Charleston, where the fields smelled of mud and green stalks, and her mother sang low songs in a language older than this country. Before her mother died in the fields when Dinah was 11. Before she was sold into the Cartwright house. Before Elias Cartwright's eyes began to follow her through rooms, weighing and measuring. Before all the rest. The rope bit deeper into her wrist as she shifted her weight. The child inside her rolled, a slow, heavy movement that stole her breath for a moment. She set her jaw. The crowd might think 19 cents meant she had no value, but the life inside her said otherwise. On the ground below, men jostled for a better view. Some had come to buy. Others had come for entertainment. Auctions were a spectacle in Savannah, a public theater of ownership and power. People brought their children. They ate roasted peanuts and gossiped with the same appetite. But even the hardened traders were restless this morning. The number 19 bothered them. It did not fit the equations they trusted. Feldman raised his hand for quiet. I am informed the woman is sound, he said. Healthy and able to work. The price reflects a private disagreement between former owner and property, not any physical defect. There were knowing chuckles at the word disagreement. Men in the crowd exchanged glances. They knew what that usually meant. A woman who had angered her mistress. Or one who carried a child her owner would rather not see. None of them knew the details. But the story was written on Dinah's body. The curve of her belly under the thin dress. The scars hidden beneath the cloth. The exhaustion in her eyes. Far from Savannah. In a Charleston study that smelled of pipe smoke and polished wood. Elias Cartwright had signed away her life for less than the price of a newspaper. 19 cents. He had chosen that number carefully, a petty cruelty sharpened into an art. A woman who should have been worth $800 or $900 reduced, on paper, to almost nothing. An insult he knew she would feel, even if she never knew the exact amount. He had arranged the sale through. his associate William Hadley, who now stood near the front of the crowd, hands folded behind his back, waiting to speak the single, insultingly low bid that would complete the transaction. Hadley did not care about the woman on the platform. To him, she was an entry on a ledger, the final payment on a get. Nothing more dot behind the first ring of buyers. Another man watched. He was tall and weathered, with a travel-stained coat and a brimmed hat pulled low. He looked like any other stranger passing through Savannah on business, but the set of his shoulders and the hard line of his mouth marked him as something else. He had come to this auction for one reason only: to keep Dinah out of the hands of the man who was not yet here, but whose shadow already stretched over the market. Thornton Graves, plantation owner, slave catcher, local power, and, though few in the crowd knew it, a man with a private use for pregnant women. A use that ended in a shallow grave on the edge of his property. The stranger who answered to the name Jacob Marsh had been told just enough that a woman from Charleston was being sent to Savannah to die, and that if he could keep her out of Graves's hands, he might save not just her life, but the life of the child she carried. Now he watched as Feldman cleared his throat and lifted the bill of sale. 19 cents. The auctioneer called. Do I have a bid of 19 cents for this property? William Hadley's hand rose automatically. 19. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. Of course, Hadley would take her at that price. The whole thing suddenly made sense. A private quarrel, a woman someone wanted rid of, a quiet trade between gentlemen. The world returned to order. Until another voice cut through the square. 25. Heads snapped toward the speaker. Thornton Graves had arrived. He stood with his arms folded, his expression almost lazy, but there was a glint in his eyes that made the men nearest him edge away. Graves was known in Chatham County. His plantation had the highest mortality rate for miles, and the whispers that followed him never quite died, no matter how loudly his money spoke. Hadley's jaw tightened. He had expected no competition. The whole deal had been arranged to be quick and simple. Graves's bid turned it into something else, a spectacle, a contest. 50 cents, Hadley called, forcing steadiness into his voice. Graves smiled, slow and unpleasant. $1. On the platform, Dinah kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, but inside, dread crawled up her spine. She had never seen Thornton Graves, but she had heard stories passed quietly between enslaved women, murmured in corners, always ending with someone saying, God keep us from that man. The number climbed. $2. 5. The crowd pressed closer. A woman offered at 19 cents was now the center of a bidding war. Whatever was happening up there was no longer just business. It was something sharper, meaner. Hadley hesitated, calculating loss and obligation. The forgiven debt from Elias Cartwright totaled $800. If he chased this bidding too high, the balance of the deal would tip against him. $2. He repeated stiffly. 5, Graves said again. Daring him to continue, Hadley looked at Feldman, then at the crowd, then finally at Dinah, whose face told him nothing at all. He stepped back. Graves had what he wanted. Or so he thought. $5 once, Feldman began. And then, from the back of the crowd, the stranger's voice spoke for the first time. 10. The market fell silent. Feldman shaded his eyes to see the bidder. Name, sir? The man tipped back his hat, revealing gray-blue eyes and a scar along his left cheek. Jacob Marsh, he said. I'm new to Savannah. I have business in the city and need domestic help. Do you have $10, Mr. Marsh? Marsh walked calmly to the front, set a leather purse on the podium, and counted out 10 silver pieces, one by one. The coins flashed in the sunlight. I do. Behind him, Graves's pleasant mask slipped. 15, he snapped. 20. Marsh answered without pause. The men began to trade numbers like blows. 30, 50, 100. By now, the crowd was openly murmuring. A woman whose seller had valued her at 19 cents now stood at $100. The price had escaped reason. This was pride now. and something dark between the two men. Dinah stood motionless, but inside she understood one thing clearly. Someone in this crowd was willing to spend a small fortune to keep her out of someone else's hands. Whoever won this battle, her life would change, but she had no idea whether that change would mean salvation or a new kind of horror. When the bidding surged past $500, Hadley slipped away, already composing the letter he would send to Elias Cartwright explaining how a simple, cruel transaction had turned into a spectacle that might have consequences neither of them had foreseen. At $1,200. Thornton Graves' voice finally broke. "Enough," he muttered. He could afford more, but he suddenly understood that this stranger would not stop until the numbers reached insanity. This was no ordinary buyer. This was an enemy. Feldman looked from Graves to Marsh. $1,200, he called. Once, twice. His palm hit the wood. Sold to Mr. Jacob Marsh for $1,200. 100 conversations exploded at once. $1,200 for a woman, offered at 19 cents. Feldman bent over his papers, hand shaking slightly as he recorded the sale. Marsh stepped forward to sign, his name flowing neatly across the deed. By law now, the woman on the platform belonged to him. Below, Graves watched with cold, contained fury. The stranger had humiliated him in public and stolen what he considered his by right. Men like Graves did not forget such insults. On the platform, the rope at Dinah's wrists was cut. Sensation flooded back into her hands as Marsh took her gently, almost formally by the arm and led her down the steps. He did not speak until they were nearly clear of the market. The noise of the crowd fading behind them. "My name is Jacob Marsh," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "You may call me that, or sir, as you choose. I will not sell you. I will not hurt you. And I will not touch you against your will." Dinah said nothing. She had heard promises before, and the world had taught her what promises from white men were worth, whether you believe me or not. He went on, "You must listen. Your life and your child's life depends on the next few days. Elias Cartwright sent you here to die. I intend to see that you live." For the first time since she was pushed onto the platform that morning, Dinah turned to look directly at him. In his eyes, she saw no pity, no lust, no casual ownership, only urgency and fear. Not fear of her, but fear for her. Jacob Marsh, whose real name she did not yet know, was Jacob Brennan, led her to a waiting wagon at the edge of the city. As he helped her climb in and turned the horse toward the pine-shadowed roads beyond Savannah, the auction square behind them buzzed with the story that would travel up and down the coast. A pregnant slave woman, sold for $1,200 after being offered for 19 cents, got no. One there knew that this was only the beginning. The wagon rattled over the uneven dirt road as Savannah faded behind them, its market stalls and brick warehouses swallowed by the dense Georgia pines. The sun was sliding lower, staining the sky gold. In the back of the wagon, Dinah kept her spine rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, though the ropes had been cut. The man who had bought her for $1,200 sat at the front, guiding the reins with sure, practiced hands. He had not spoken since they left the city limits. Not out of discomfort, his silence felt intentional, as though he was listening for dangers she could not yet hear. Finally, when the last sign of the city had disappeared behind a bend, he spoke. "You may sit forward if you wish. The wind is cooler up here." Dinah stayed where she was. He nodded, as if he expected her refusal. "My name," he said quietly, "is Jacob Marsh, but that is not the name I was born with." She looked up. He did not turn, but his voice carried across the creaking wagon bed. "You were meant to be purchased today by a man named Thornton Graves. Do you know that name?" A chill crawled down her spine. She did not know Graves personally, but she had heard whispers, always in low voices, always when they thought no overseer was near. Women spoke of him the way people speak of sickness or storms. Something to fear, but impossible to avoid. Dinah shook her head. "Be glad," Jacob said. "Everything that brought you to Savannah was arranged to deliver you to him." The trees closed thick around them, their branches blocking the sinking light. Jacob guided the horse to a narrower trail, barely visible between brush. Your owner in Charleston, Cartwright, is not a fool, he continued. He knew exactly what he was doing when he set your price at 19 cents. The number struck her like a blow. She had wondered. She had feared. But hearing it said aloud made something inside her. Crack. Jacob kept his eyes on the path. 19 cents means take her and do whatever you want. She is worthless to me. Men like Graves know that message well. He has bought several women under similar circumstances. Dinah pressed her hand protectively to her stomach. What does he do? She whispered. Jacob didn't answer at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and grim. He makes sure they never reappear. The forest swallowed the last of the daylight. A whippoorwill cried somewhere deep among the pines. The horse snorted nervously. Dinah felt her breath catch. How do you know these things? That was when Jacob pulled the wagon to a halt. He turned fully toward her for the first time since the auction. His expression was not cruel or pitying, only honest. Because my name is not Jacob Marsh, he said. It is Jacob Brennan, and I work with people who move enslaved men and women to freedom. I came to Savannah because word reached us that you were in danger. Serious danger. I was instructed to get you out before Graves could take you. Dinah stared at him. Stunned. The Underground Railroad was a whispered myth, something people hoped was real but never expected to touch their own lives. A story of lantern signals and secret codes, of strangers risking everything to help people they had never met. You risked yourself, she murmured. For me, I risked myself, he corrected gently, because your life matters. Because no one deserves the fate that was planned for you. And because someone in Charleston reached out, someone who has been watching you for years. Dinah's heart stumbled. Who? Jacob reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, worn soft at the edges. Read it, he said. Her fingers shook as she opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Dinah, if you are reading this, the first part of our plan has worked. Trust the man who brings you this letter. He's not what he seems. Bethy, one word leapt from the page. Be thy dot, the elderly cook from the Cartwright household. The woman who had moved quietly through the kitchen for decades, ignored by almost everyone, including Elias and Constance Cartwright. Dinah felt her throat tighten. She helped me? Jacob nodded. She has been part of a network for a long time. Sends information when she can. She saw what Cartwright was doing to you. She saw what he did to your child. Her breath hitched. Her daughter Ruth sold away 2 years earlier. Dinah had screamed until she collapsed. She had never imagined Bethy witnessed her grief and carried it quietly to strangers who cared enough. The wagon rolled forward again, following a winding path through the woods. We're not going far, Jacob said. There is a safe place where you can rest. People who will protect you until we can move north. Why not leave now? Dinah asked urgently. Before Graves learns who bought me. Jacob's jaw tightened. Because Graves will expect us to flee tonight. His men will be watching the main roads. If we run now, we will not make it 20 miles. You're safer hiding close by, hidden in plain sight. He glanced over his shoulder at her. You have been running your entire life, Dinah. Tonight, we sit still. The words felt strange. Rest was a luxury enslaved people were never granted. After nearly an hour, the wagon stopped at a small clearing. A cabin stood there, half hidden by pines, smoke curling from its chimney. 2 women waited outside, one older, with a blue headscarf and eyes sharp enough to see through bone. The other younger, her hands strong from labor but warm as she reached to help Dinah down from the wagon. You got her? The older woman said to Jacob, her voice both relief and warning. I did, he answered. But Graves was at the auction. Both women stiffened. This way, child, the older woman said softly. My name is Sarah. This is my daughter, Hannah. You're safe with us. Safe. The word felt unfamiliar, but as Dinah stepped into the dim, warm cabin, smelling of cornbread and wood smoke, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not quite trust. Not quite relief, but The faint stirring of possibility got behind her. Jacob Brennan closed the door quietly, and the hunt began. The cabin was warmer than Dinah expected, warm enough that the chill from the wagon ride melted from her bones. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting an orange glow across the small room. For a moment, she simply stood inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust, letting the unfamiliar feeling of safety tenuous and fragile settle around her. Sarah, the older woman, guided her toward a wooden chair beside the fire. "Sit, child. You're trembling." Dinah hadn't realized she was. Her hands shook uncontrollably now that there were no ropes binding them, no auctioneer barking her price, no men calculating what she might be worth or how much suffering they could coax from her body. Hannah set down a bowl of steaming stew. The smell beans, salt pork, and onions made Dinah's stomach twist with hunger. "You eat," Hannah said. "Slowly. You need strength." Dinah lifted the spoon with shaking fingers and took a small sip. The food was warm, rich, real. She closed her eyes. She hadn't tasted anything like it in months. Maybe years. Jacob remained near the door, scanning the windows as though danger could emerge from the dark at any moment. It could. When Sarah noticed his tension, she spoke quietly. "She needs rest." "So do you." Jacob shook his head. "Not yet. Graves will start asking questions tonight." Dinah flinched at the name. The shadow of that man seemed to follow them, thickening the air in the room. Sarah stepped closer to Jacob, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You got her out. That's the hardest part." Jacob didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, as if he was already imagining the next danger, the next road, the next lie he would need to tell. Finally, he turned toward Dinah. "I'll be back by morning. I need to check the roads. Make sure no one followed us." Dinah looked up sharply. "You're leaving?" He hesitated. "I'll return. I promise." Dinah didn't trust promises, not from white men, not from anyone with power or her life. But his voice held no deceit, only urgency. She gave a small nod. Hannah placed another log onto the fire. Sarah led Jacob outside for a brief conversation, voices low, urgent before he mounted his horse and disappeared into the forest. Dinah watched the door long after he was gone. A night of unspoken things later, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, Dinah lay on a small cot in the far corner of the cabin. Hannah sat near her, mending a shirt. Sarah sorted herbs, dried leaves rustling like whispers. For a while, the only sound was the crackling fire. Then Sarah spoke. "You're wondering why we're helping you." Dinah didn't respond. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Because someone helped us," Sarah said simply. "This network, this railroad, it runs both ways. Every hand that pulls another forward was pulled forward by someone else once." Hannah looked up from her sewing. "Mama was helped by a conductor when she fled from a plantation outside Macon. I was born in hiding." Dinah blinked in surprise. "You were slaves?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Once. Long ago. But freedom isn't something you keep just for yourself. You pass it on? That's how this works." Hannah added, "Your name began moving through the network months ago." "My name?" Dinah whispered, "Why?" "Because of what Cartwright did," Sarah said gently. "Because Bethy sent word? Because women notice what is done to other women?" Dinah felt a pressure behind her eyes, a mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Sarah exchanged a glance with her daughter. "Now," she said, "you wait for Jacob to return. He'll tell us when it's safe to move. He'll arrange the next step north. And Graves?" This time both women's faces darkened. Sarah inhaled slowly as if steadying herself before speaking. "Graves has taken women before. Pregnant women. Women nobody wanted. Women sold for almost nothing. They go to his plantation." Hannah finished the sentence for her. "And they never come out." Dinah's blood went cold. There it was. The truth her body had been screaming since the auction. The terror she had swallowed because she had no other choice. She set the bowl aside, appetite gone. "Why me?" she whispered. Why did Cartwright send me to someone like him? Sarah touched her shoulder gently. Because men like Cartwright care more about shame than they do about lives. He wanted rid of you, child. He wanted rid of the proof he created inside you. Dinah lowered her gaze. Hot tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried too many tears for men who did not deserve them. Hannah moved to her side, offering a cup of water. You're safe here? She said again. Not forever. But for tonight? For tonight. It was more safety than Dinah had known in years. Dreams and warnings, Dinah fell asleep sometime after midnight. Her dreams were tangled in restless images of rice fields. Her mother's voice, the sound of her daughter Ruth screaming as she was carried away. She woke suddenly, heart pounding. Sarah sat in a chair by the window, watching the dark woods. It's only a bad dream, she said softly. It felt real. All bad dreams feel real, until they don't. Dinah shifted uncomfortably, her hand instinctively on her belly. The baby moved slow, steady, reminding her why she had to survive. Why she must? You're stronger than you know, Sarah murmured. Dinah closed her eyes, trying to believe it. A footstep in the dark near dawn. Dinah woke again to the sound of hooves outside slow. Her breath caught. Graves? Graves' men? But Sarah rose calmly. That'll be Jacob. Relief washed over Dinah so hard she nearly tipped off the cot. Jacob stepped through the door moments later, covered in dust, face grim. Something's wrong, he said immediately. Graves is already asking questions. He's offering money for anyone who can tell him who I am or where I took you. Hannah swore under her breath. Sarah crossed her arms tightly. He suspects you? He knows I'm not who I claim to be, Jacob replied. And he won't stop? He looked directly at Dinah, then really looked, and she saw something new in his expression. Fear. Not for himself. For her. We don't have much time, Jacob said. He set his jaw. We moved tonight. Dawn seeped into the cabin slowly, a gray light filtering through the cracks between the shutters as the fire died to a bed of warm embers. Dinah sat at the small wooden table, while Sarah poured hot water over dried leaves. Making a bitter tea meant to calm a racing heart. Jacob had returned only minutes earlier, his boots still wet with morning dew, his face drawn in tight lines that told her everything before he spoke a single word. Graves was searching. Graves had begun the hunt already. The knowledge hung in the air like smoke, thick and hard to breathe through. Dinah wrapped her fingers around the warm tin cup, but even the heat could not stop the trembling in her hands. She had been hunted before by fear, by men, by the rules that said her life belonged to anyone who claimed her, but never like this. Never with her unborn child twisting inside her, reminding her with every movement what she stood to lose. Jacob paced the length of the cabin, refusing Sarah's offer of food, refusing to sit. He was in the city before midnight, he said, rubbing a hand over his jaw, asking who I am, showing my description. Someone told him I left quickly. He'll assume I left with her. He nodded toward Dinah without looking at her, as though the guilt of dragging her into danger weighed heavier than the truth, that she had been in danger long before he ever entered her life. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Then the roads aren't safe, she said. Not the main ones. Not the river path either. Hannah, who had been silent until now, snapped a thread loudly between her teeth. So, what do we do? Wait for him to come knocking? Jacob shook his head. We move tonight. After sunset, quietly. Dinah felt the words settle like stones in her stomach. Move. Again. Run. Again. She had not stopped. Running not truly since. Elias Cartwright first put his eyes on her when she was a child. Every breath since then had been stolen on borrowed time. Sarah set her cup down and walked to the corner where wooden chests sat beneath quilts. She knelt, lifted the lid, and pulled out a thin leather-bound book worn soft at the edges. Dinah watched as Sarah carried it to the table and placed it gently before her, as though it were something living. Before you go, Sarah said, her voice suddenly softer, there's something you need to understand. Dinah opened the journal hesitantly. The pages smelled of smoke and age. The handwriting inside was careful, deliberate, written by a woman who knew that stories must be preserved even when the world wished them erased. Her name was Abigail, Sarah said, sinking slowly into the chair beside her. She lived on Thornton Graves's plantation for years. She's gone now? Consumption took her. But before she died, she wrote down everything she saw, everything she suspected, everything she feared. Dinah's heartbeat quickened. She looked down at the first page, where Abigail had written a date in a single line. He brought another one today. Pregnant. Afraid. And I fear she will meet the same end. The words tightened around Dinah's ribs like a noose. She turned the page. More dates. More entries. More women. Always pregnant. Always kept apart from the others. Always screaming at night. Always gone within weeks. She felt nausea rise in her throat, and she closed the journal quickly, pressing her hand to her mouth. Sarah placed a steady hand on her back. "This is why Cartwright sent you south," she said quietly. "He knew Graves would buy you. He knew what Graves does." Dinah forced in a breath. Her body felt too small to hold the terror rising inside her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would a man do such a thing?" Sarah's face hardened into something older than grief. "Because the law told him he could," she said. "Because no one stopped him. Because power without consequence becomes a sickness." Dinah stared down at her own hands, remembering the way Cartwright looked at her as though she were nothing, remembering Constance's cold eyes, remembering Ruth's screams fading into the street. Hannah moved toward the door, checking the trees beyond the window. "We won't let him touch her," she said firmly. Jacob stopped pacing. For the first time since dawn, his gaze settled fully on Dinah. "He won't get near you," he said, and there was something fierce in his voice, not a promise made lightly, but a vow forged in the bones of a man who had seen too much and lost too many. Dinah knew better than to trust vows, but she also knew what fear felt like and what it didn't. Jacob's presence did not frighten her. That alone unsettled her more than anything else. The rest of the day passed slowly, thick with unspoken dread. They kept the shutters closed and the fire low. Dinah rested when she could, waking often to the sound of Jacob whispering with Sarah outside, planning routes, calculating risks. By late afternoon, a soft rain began to fall, tapping gently against the roof. Hannah prepared a small satchel for Dinah bread, dried beans, a flask of water, a blanket rolled tight. Dinah watched her hands move with practiced precision. This was not the first time Hannah had packed such supplies. It would not be the last dot when night finally came. The rain had deepened into a steady curtain. Jacob stepped inside, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "This is good," he said. "Cover, sound, we move now." Dinah rose slowly, feeling the weight of her unborn child, the weight of the journal still open on the table, the weight of all the women whose names she would never know but whose footsteps she now followed. Sarah embraced her tightly, her voice a soft murmur at Dinah's ear. "You walk for all of them, child. Don't you forget that?" Hannah squeezed her hand once hard, steadying, before opening the back door to the dark woods beyond. Dinah stepped out into the rain, Jacob close behind her, his hand lightly touching her elbow to guide her through the mud. The forest loomed, wet and whispering, every shadow alive with possibility and threat, as the cabin faded behind them, swallowed by darkness. Dinah felt the world tilt beneath her, but she walked anyway, because stopping had never been an option. Ahead lay the unknown. Behind lay death. And in the space between those two truths, she carried hope like a lantern cupped against the wind. Rain slicked the narrow path as Jacob led Dinah deeper into the woods, the sound of water masking their footsteps and softening the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. The darkness was thick, broken only by occasional flashes of pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. Dinah clutched the small satchel Hannah had prepared, feeling the weight of every step settle into her bones. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy with rainwater. and each movement sent a dull ache through her lower back, a reminder that she was not traveling alone. That every mile she walked was carried by two bodies, not one. Jacob moved ahead of her silently, pausing often to listen. She watched his silhouette, shoulders tense and alert, the outline of a man who had walked dangerous paths many times before. She trusted him only as far as she could trust any stranger. But his presence steadied her in a way she did not want to examine too closely. After nearly an hour, he stopped beneath a leaning pine and motioned for her to join him. "We stay off the main road," he whispered. "Graves will have men posted there. Same with the river crossing." Dinah nodded, though the idea that men might be searching for her already made her stomach knot. Jacob's eyes searched the darkness behind them. "He's moving faster than I expected," he murmured. "Word travels fast when a man like Graves wants something." Or someone, Dinah thought, wrapping her arms around herself as a shiver crawled up her spine. The rain dripped from the brim of Jacob's hat, sliding down his coat in steady rivulets. "There's a trail ahead," he said. "It's almost invisible. Deer use it, maybe a hunter or two. Graves won't think to watch it. That's our way out." They pressed onward, slipping between trees and stepping over roots slick with moss. The forest seemed endless, the shadows crowding closer as the storm grew heavier. Dinah's legs burned with exhaustion, her breath coming in short bursts. She gripped her side where a stitch of pain jabbed deep beneath her ribs, but she forced herself to keep going. Stopping meant being caught. Stopping meant Graves. Jacob must have sensed her flagging strength because he slowed, offering his arm wordlessly. She hesitated, her pride rising instinctively, but finally took it. The warmth of his hand through the soaked cloth startled her. Gentle, steady, human. For a moment, she remembered what it felt like to be touched without ownership behind it. They walked like that for several minutes until Jacob paused again, listening. At first, Dinah heard nothing but rain and wind. But then a faint echo carried through the trees, hoofbeats, distant but fast. Jacob swore under his breath and pulled her toward a cluster of fallen logs. "Down," he whispered urgently. "Now." Dinah crouched low, biting back a wince as her knees hit wet earth. Jacob crouched beside her, his hand lightly pressing her shoulder to keep her still. The hoofbeats grew louder, splashing through muddy pools, then slowed. Voices followed, two men, maybe three muffled by rain, but close enough that she caught pieces of their conversation. "Marshall says the man's calling himself Jacob Marsh. Paid a fortune for some pregnant girl. Graves wants her alive. Says she's his." Dinah closed her eyes against the rising terror, forcing her breath to stay quiet, small, invisible. Mud seeped through her dress, cold and slick, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic fist. The riders lingered, lantern light flickering through the trees. Jacob leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't move," he murmured. "Don't even breathe deep." She nodded almost imperceptibly. The light drifted past, the hoofbeats faded slowly down the main road. Only when they were far beyond hearing did Jacob exhale and release his grip on her shoulder. "That was too close," he said, rising carefully and helping her to her feet. Dinah's legs trembled beneath her, mud streaking her dress, her palms raw from bracing herself. "They knew your name," she whispered. Jacob looked away, jaw tight. "They know the name I gave them," he corrected softly. "It's not the same." But his voice carried a shadow of doubt. Graves was unraveling the threads faster than planned. They resumed walking, this time more quickly, deeper into a part of the forest where the trees grew tighter and the path thinned to little more than a suggestion. Hours passed, or maybe only one time became slippery in the wet, endless dark. The forest smelled of pine resin and wet earth, but underneath it, there was something else, a faint sour scent of still water. When the trees finally opened onto the banks of a shallow marshland, Jacob stopped. "This is the place," he said. "Few people come through here. The mud scares them off, but there's a crossing if you know where to look." Dinah stared at the murky water, reeds swaying in the wind. "We go through that?" she asked, her voice low. "We do," Jacob said. It'll hide our tracks. And Graves's men won't follow past the tree line. Dinah didn't know whether to feel or terrified. She took a step toward the marsh and felt her foot sink into cold mud up to her ankle. Jacob reached to steady her again. Careful. There's boardwalk under some of this, buried years ago. Step where I step. She followed him slowly through the marsh, the water rising to her calves, her dress tangling around her knees. The mud tried to claim her feet with every movement. Twice Jacob caught her before she slipped, his grip firm but never harsh. Lightning crackled faintly in the distance, illuminating the marsh in a ghostly flash. Dinah could see the water stretching endlessly, black and still. No eyes watching. No riders. No graves. Somewhere in the wet silence, she felt her fear loosen just a little when they reached the solid ground on the other side. Jacob helped her climb onto a low bank. She collapsed to her knees, breathless, mud-streaked, trembling. He knelt beside her. We're almost there, he said softly. A place to rest. Just a little farther. Dinah nodded, too exhausted to speak. She rose slowly, leaning heavily on Jacob's arm. They resumed walking, the rain easing into a mist. After another half-mile, a faint orange glow appeared through the trees, the promise of shelter, of warmth, of a hidden place no one would think to search. Jacob guided her toward it. Dinah didn't know what waited ahead, or how close Graves truly was. But, for the first time since she had stepped onto the auction block, she allowed herself to believe she might survive the night. The faint orange glow grew brighter as Dinah and Jacob pushed through the last stretch of dripping trees. The forest floor sloped gently upward, and as they climbed, Dinah could feel her legs trembling with exhaustion. Every root felt like a trap, every branch a hand reaching to drag her backward into the darkness. Then, at the crest of the hill, the light revealed itself fully, a small hunter's shack tucked beneath a massive bent oak, its chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke into the misty night. Jacob slowed and lifted a hand, signaling her to stop. He scanned the clearing with practiced eyes, listening for anything unusual. The air felt tight, held between breaths. After a tense moment, he nodded. It's clear, he whispered. Dinah followed him toward the shack, her feet dragging through wet leaves. Up close, the building looked older than she expected, the wooden planks weathered and soft with age. The door creaked as Jacob eased it open. Warmth spilled into the night dot inside. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew Jacob. Because there was a blanket folded neatly on a pallet, a kettle hung above the flames, and a lantern placed on the table. Dinah stepped inside and immediately felt her shoulders sag. She hadn't realized how desperately her body craved warmth until it enveloped her. Jacob shut the door behind them, sliding a heavy wooden bar into place. There's food, he said, nodding toward a small tin box and a loaf of rough bread. Not much, but enough. Dinah lowered herself onto the pallet, the soft fabric beneath her a small heaven after hours of walking. Her boots squelched as she removed them, and she winced at the sight of her swollen, mud-smeared feet. Jacob knelt near the fire, stirring the coals until they flared brighter. For a moment he didn't speak. The silence in the cabin was thick, comforting, and dangerous at the same time. Dinah watched him from the pallet, noticing how the firelight softened the hard lines of his face, how exhaustion pulled at his shoulders. He looked less like the fierce stranger who had outbid Graves at the auction, and more like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. You're thinking, Dinah said quietly. Jacob didn't look up. I'm always thinking. That's the only way to stay alive. She tucked the blanket around her legs. You think Graves is close? He's closer than we want. Jacob added another piece of wood to the fire. But far enough that we can rest here for a few hours. Rest. It sounded like a luxury. Dinah let the words settle inside her slowly, unsure whether she dared believe in it. Jacob finally turned to face her. His eyes flicked to her hands, her face, her belly. How do you feel? She hesitated. It had been so long since anyone asked her that with genuine concern that she forgot how to answer. Tired, she said at last. Everything hurts. My feet, my back, my ribs. Her hand rested on her stomach. The baby's quiet? Jacob's expression tightened. Quiet how? Not still, she said quickly. Just tired like me. He nodded, relief softening the tension in his features. It's been a long night for both of you. Dinah studied him by the firelight. Why are you helping me, Jacob? Truly. He held her gaze for a long moment before answering. Because someone has to. That can't be the only reason. He exhaled, leaning back against the wall. I've seen what men like Graves do. I've seen what the law allows them to do. And I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. His eyes darkened. I won't be silent. Dinah felt something twist in her chest. Not quite trust, but the beginning of something that might grow into it. Jacob rose and rummaged through the supplies left for them. He found a cloth and a small tin of salve. Let me see your feet, he said gently. She stiffened. I can tend them myself. You can, he agreed, but you shouldn't have to. The simple truth of the words struck her harder than she expected. Slowly, she extended her foot. Jacob worked carefully, washing away mud, checking for cuts, rubbing salve into the raw places where her skin had split. He kept his touch steady and respectful, his gaze never lingering too long. Dinah watched him in silence, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't name. No one had touched her without purpose or ownership in years. No one had tended her except to prepare her for more labor, more suffering. When he finished, Jacob sat back and wiped his hands on a cloth. You should sleep. We leave before dawn. Dinah. She lay back on the pallet, listening to the crackle of the fire, feeling the warmth seep slowly into her bones. Jacob remained awake near the door, rifle within reach, his silhouette sharp against the shifting light. Jacob? She murmured, her eyes drifting closed. Yes? Do you ever get afraid? He froze for a moment before answering. Yes, he said quietly. More often than I'd like. Then why keep doing this? He looked into the fire. Because fear means the world still has something worth saving. Dinah let the words settle around her like a blanket. Outside, the rain softened into a whisper. Inside, the fire glowed brighter. Her last thought before sleep took her was that, for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel completely alone, and for a woman who had lived her life in chains, that was almost enough to feel like freedom. Dinah woke to the faintest gray light pressing through the cracks in the cabin walls. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The warmth, the soft blanket, the quiet, all of it felt too gentle, too strange. Then the ache in her limbs returned, the memory of the marsh and the rain and Jacob's steady hand guiding her through the dark. She shifted and winced. Her back throbbed from the long journey, and her belly felt tight, the baby rolling sluggishly beneath her ribs. Jacob sat exactly where she had last seen him, back straight, rifle resting across his knees, eyes half open yet alert. He had not slept. She could tell by the way his shoulders remained stiff, by the faint tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his coat. He noticed her stirring and spoke without turning fully. We leave now? The rain bought us some time, but it won't hold them off forever. Dinah pushed herself upright, blinking against the cold morning draft that crept through the cracks. Jacob offered her a small piece of bread and a cup of water. She ate slowly, trying not to think about how little strength she had left. It would have to be enough outside. The forest felt different than it had last night. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving everything sharp and bright. But beneath the freshness lay something else. Attention, like the woods themselves were listening. Jacob checked the tracks around the shack, scanning the mud with narrowed eyes. No riders, he murmured, but they'll circle back. Graves doesn't give up. The mention of Graves made her throat tighten. She couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, but she felt his presence like a shadow stretching across the land. She followed Jacob down a narrow deer trail that wound through the trees, her feet tender but more bearable after the salve he had applied. Each step was deliberate, careful. The forest canopy caught the early light, scattering it in thin golden beams that cut through the cooler shadows below. They walked for more than an hour in silence until Jacob suddenly raised a hand, commanding her to stop. Dinah froze instantly, heart pounding. He listened, tilting his head slightly toward the wind. At first she heard nothing, then a distant crack of a branch. Not close, but not far enough. Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. They're behind us? Panic surged through her chest like a rushing tide. She instinctively wrapped an arm around her belly, as if shielding the child inside from the world that wanted to consume them both. How many? She whispered. 2, maybe 3, he said. Not Graves himself yet. Scouts. He pointed toward the thicket ahead. We go through there. It'll slow them, not us. Dinah followed him into the dense underbrush where vines twisted between trees and the ground dipped unpredictably. The branches clawed at her dress. Twigs snapped under her feet. But the thickness of the brush offered protection. Anyone on horseback would struggle to follow. Jacob moved fast, slipping between trees with the precision of a man who had spent years navigating dangerous terrain. Dinah tried to keep up, but the ground sloped sharply downward, and her weakened legs buckled. Jacob caught her before she fell, one hand gripping her elbow. The other pressed to her back to steady her. Easy, he murmured. You're doing fine. She wanted to believe him. They kept moving until they reached a shallow ravine where a narrow stream trickled over smooth stones. Jacob helped her down the slope. Walk in the water, he said. It hides tracks. The cold water stung her feet, but she stepped in without complaint, wading carefully downstream. The sound of flowing water eased her nerves, but Jacob's constant glances over his shoulder told her the danger had not passed. The stream curved between high banks, creating a natural tunnel of earth and roots. Here the world felt muffled, distant safer, somehow. Jacob slowed. We rest here a moment, he said. Dinah sank onto a flat stone, breathing heavily. Jacob crouched beside her, scanning the ridge above. They're close, he said softly. Closer than I expected. Graves must have pushed them hard. Dinah swallowed hard. Why does he want me so badly? Jacob hesitated. She saw something shift in his expression, a truth he had not wanted to speak yet. Because you were meant to disappear on his land, he said. He can't risk losing you. You were part of a pattern. A pattern someone was starting to notice. Her stomach twisted. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly on her lap. I don't want to die, she whispered. Not like those other women. Jacob reached out, hesitated, then placed a steady hand over hers. You won't, he said, his voice low and certain. Not while I can fight. Before she could respond, a distant shout echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable. Jacob jerked his hand back and stood. They've found the shack, he said. They know we moved north. Dinah pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp twinge in her abdomen. Jacob stepped into the stream, offering his hand again. This time she didn't hesitate. She took it, gripping him tightly as they moved quickly through the ravine, water splashing around their ankles. The shouts behind them grew louder, angrier. The chase had begun in earnest. Jacob led her up a narrow bank where the forest thickened again. The air grew heavy with silence, an unnatural quiet that made every heartbeat sound too loud. Once we reach the ridge, he murmured, there's a small cabin. A contact. Someone I trust. Dinah nodded, forcing her breath to stay even, forcing her legs to keep moving. She didn't know how much farther she could go, but she would not stop. Not with Graves behind her. Not with a child inside her depending on her for survival. They climbed the last slope, mud sliding beneath their feet. Jacob pulled her the final few yards until they reached the ridge's crest. Through the trees, she saw a small shape, a roof half hidden beneath branches. Relief washed over, so strong her knees nearly buckled. Jacob tightened his grip on her arm. Just a little farther, he whispered. But before they could move, a gunshot cracked through the forest. Jacob shoved her to the ground as bark exploded from the tree beside them. Dinah fell hard. The breath knocked from her chest. The hunters had arrived. and Graves was no longer as far behind as they had hoped. The world rang with the echo of the gunshot as Jacob dragged Dinah behind a fallen log, his breath sharp and controlled, even as the air seemed to crackle with danger. Dinah's heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her fingertips. Every throb a reminder that her body was no longer only hers, that the child inside her felt every jolt, every terror. Jacob raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence, then peered over the log with the caution of a man who had survived too many close calls to waste a single movement. Voices drifted through the trees low, tense, arguing. Dinah couldn't make out the words, but the tone told her everything she needed to know. The riders had found their trail, and they were closing in. Jacob leaned close, his whisper barely a breath. "We have to move. Slowly. Stay low." She nodded, though her legs trembled violently. The pain in her abdomen had sharpened since the climb, a tightness that came and went like the closing fist of some unseen hand. "Not now," she begged silently. "Not here. Not like this." Jacob guided her along the ground, weaving between roots and brush until they reached a cluster of pine trees, whose thick branches cast deep shadows. The forest floor was soft with needles, muffling their footsteps as they crawled between the trunks. Dinah clung to Jacob's sleeve, knowing she could not do this alone. Another shot rang out closer this time. Jacob stiffened, jaw clenched. "They're trying to pin us," he whispered. "Drive us out into open ground." Dinah swallowed, her throat dry with fear. "Can we reach the cabin?" Jacob hesitated just long enough for her stomach to twist. "Yes," he said finally. "But once we reach it, everything changes." They broke from the trees into a narrow clearing that sloped downward toward the small cabin Jacob had mentioned earlier. It stood crooked but sturdy, smoke trailing gently from the chimney, the sign of someone waiting. But before they could reach it, a shout tore through the woods behind them. "There, up the ridge." Dinah gasped as two riders burst from the trees, rifles glinting in the pale morning light. Jacob grabbed her hand. "Run." She didn't think, she just moved. Every step felt like fire shooting up her legs, but the instinct to survive pushed her forward. The baby lurched inside her, startled by her pounding steps. Another gunshot whipped past them, splintering a stump ahead. Jacob threw his arm around her shoulders, shielding her as they stumbled down the slope toward the cabin. The door burst open before they reached it. A tall woman with a scar down her cheek stood on the porch, shotgun already raised. "Get inside," she barked, voice fierce and commanding. Jacob practically carried Dinah through the door as the woman fired once, the blast roaring like thunder. The riders jerked back, their horses rearing in shock. Jacob slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy iron bar across it. Dinah collapsed onto the floor, gasping, every muscle trembling. The woman strode toward her without lowering the gun. "I'm Miriam," she said. "Jacob sent word you'd be coming. Didn't expect an entourage behind you." Jacob was already at the window, checking the tree line. "Graves' men," he said. "Closer than they should be." Miriam's mouth tightened. "Then they'll force our hand sooner than planned." Dinah forced herself upright, gripping the edge of a chair for balance. "What plan?" she whispered. Jacob looked at her, not with fear, but with resolve, with something fierce and unshakable burning behind his eyes. "The plan to make sure you get out of Georgia," he said, "even if they burn this cabin to the ground." Outside, the horses circled, voices rising, angry and impatient. The hunters had found them. The walls felt too thin, the cabin too small, the world outside too dangerous. Dinah pressed a hand to her belly, feeling a tightening that lasted longer this time, sharper, deeper. She inhaled sharply through her teeth. Jacob turned immediately. "What's wrong?" Dinah met his eyes, the truth breaking through her fear like lightning. "Jacob, something's happening. Something with the baby." Miriam's eyes widened, not with panic, but with the grim understanding of someone who had seen too much of life and death. Outside, another shot cracked. Inside, Dinah doubled. Over as pain rippled through her abdomen in a fierce, undeniable wave. The child she carried had chosen this moment, this impossible, dangerous moment to begin his way into the world. And the hunters were already at the door.